All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Madeleine Rowan-Davis. It's August 22nd, 2023. We're at Abbott Claim Vineyard in Carlton. Madeleine, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Rich.
First question is, why wine?
Well, it was, for me, kind of an accident. I was out of college. I went to work for a company that did environmental consulting. And so mainly wildlife biology research kind of stuff at the time pertaining to birds of prey. And I had a friend visiting from the East Coast. We took wine tasting and had a really fun time at the Bonny Doon tasting room, Bonny Doon Vineyard tasting room in Bonny Doon back then. And kind of jokingly asked if they were hiring, which the woman that served me, Margaret, she became a good friend years later, over the years, but she took me completely seriously and went and got the manager right away. So I ended up actually applying and getting a weekend job pouring wine in the tasting room, which I got sucked more and more into, to where I was working 7 days a week. And at one point, my ecological consulting position had a break between projects, and I ended up applying for a full-time opening that they had and got sucked in fully to sales and marketing, actually. I ran a 8,000 member wine club for Bonny Doon, and I stayed there for about 8 years. I loved it. It was a really great experience. A lot of great creative people at that company. And then decided that I had seen enough of cubicles and the insides of offices and needed to get back outdoors. So that's how I transitioned into the vineyard. I left Bonny Doon and went to UC Davis to study viticulture.
So many things to follow up on there, but we'll back up for a second. Tell us about your life before wine, where you were born and raised, and what kind of the path to college was for you.
So I was actually born in Canada. My mom was an art student in Toronto and met my dad over there. And we moved a few times before we came to Oregon. I arrived in Oregon when I was 5. So I did all my early education through high school in Eugene. And then, let's see, I went to undergrad back east, Mount Holyoke College. It's a women's college on the East Coast, the oldest continuingly women's college in the U.S. And yeah, I don't know where to go from there.
Coming out of that, at what point did sort of the environmental part of things come into line? What were you thinking about as like a long-term career coming out of college?
Oh, gosh. Coming out of college, I had been fully focused on ecology and evolutionary theory. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but I thought maybe the only path that made sense would be to be a professor, and do research and writing. And so that was sort of the path I was looking to pursue. I moved to California with my college boyfriend, who was starting a doctoral program at UC Santa Cruz, and thought that it would be a great opportunity to establish residency and get cheaper graduate study. And then, ended up pursuing wine instead. Well, I guess I did graduate school too, but it was a completely different shift by then.
Different order of things, perhaps. So you mentioned kind of wine as starting off almost as a joke, as like So tell me about the initial work and what attracted you to the work as you started to get into wine.
So working in a tasting room was a fantastic experience. Bonny Doon was such a creative place from a lot of different perspectives. The wine labels, he's famous for those, but the wine as well was hugely creative. I was exposed to so many different winemaking practices, styles, grape varieties. Some of the crazy Italian stuff that we did was really unique. So it was intellectually stimulating, always. Plus, it was a lot of fun. We had a very busy tasting room in those days, and a large staff of people from all different walks of life, retirees, and we had a full-time pharmaceutical chemist who just would come one day a week on the weekends he'd work for wine. And, it was just a really unique group of people. So it was a fun environment. It was fast-paced. You were always busy, but you're always learning.
So speaking of learning, tell me about learning wine. Obviously, it's a big topic. So tell me about starting to understand it and what again, kind of what pushed you to learn more about it.
I think that the concept of being able to perceive aromas that resembled, flavors and aromas that you pick up in other foods and stuff was kind of fascinating. That was the initial thing that really drew me into it, was trying to teach my palate and learn how to detect differences between wines and describe them. We'd had some wines that would be like I think at one point Randall made a ripasso. So you get like all the flavors from raisins in a wine that's not high alcohol and sweet. It was full of complexity. And that was just exciting and kind of open-ended. I had a lot of friends at the time who were training to become sommelier. I joined a couple of tasting groups where I was tasting predominantly with people who are now somms, most of them. And, again, it was an area where I could just keep learning. And then getting to the next phase of learning how to attribute qualities to the grape growing and the region it came from, and learning about the different growing regions around the world. Just sort of a great way to take something that's very simple in one respect, right? And expand it exponentially. And I love travel. I love food. So all of these things kind of come together in the wine industry.
So obviously Bonny Doon is a pretty highly thought of and highly sought after place. Tell me about when you were there. Did you kind of understand the gravity of the place you were working at?
I did and I didn't. For the first couple of years that I was working there, I was mostly in the tasting room just having fun. I don't think I realized quite how unique it was in comparison to other places and other tasting room scenes. I did go wine tasting. I went up to Sonoma County and Napa County and did some tasting tours. I came up to Oregon and did a wine tasting trip. I still, my family's been in Oregon through this entire time, so I was up there pretty frequently. And I think it took some of the shifts at Bonny Doon, like he went through some major transitions, a brand sale where we dropped from nearly 500,000 case production down to 30,000 case production in, a matter of moments. That kind of made it more obvious what a unique place it was, right? That you never knew what was going to happen. You're always on your toes.
You mentioned kind of getting to full-time work and handling a wine club. Tell me about that kind of challenge. What's it like handling a wine club of that size?
It was extremely challenging. I think that as with most things where you rely heavily on technology and softwares, that aspect was at times incredibly frustrating. This was quite a few years ago too, so the technology that was out there was perhaps a lot less user-friendly than it is now. I had a huge database of member information, and in order to use it effectively, I had to learn access database management, export everything, and then run a million queries to make sure that I was using accurate data before I did a mail merge and sent out information to clients and all of that. So technology was a hang up, and then just the volume of customer service entailed in that was also pretty intense. When I first started there, we had, I think, 2 people answering phones. And we just couldn't keep up with it. Club shipment would go out and everyone's calling to update their credit card information, or calling to cancel because they saw a charge went through and they'd forgotten to cancel. And so it was just, the volume of customer service was incredible. We had to expand our department at that time, and that helped tremendously. But we also did a lot, like redesigning our website, to have a members area so that people could do certain updates and things themselves. Again, it was fairly cutting edge for the time. Now I think probably every software out there that people use for wine club management allows a certain level of clients managing their own accounts and whatnot.
What did you learn during those years about what sells wine? What were people excited about? Why did people buy the wines they bought?
That's a good question. Obviously, so in the tasting room environment, people are buying wines that they enjoy and they like the taste of. Outside of that, it was also more experiential. Like if they were having a fun time, then they would buy more wine. They would enjoy the wine more. And I think one thing that people liked at Bonny Doon, and it might be sort of self-selecting, right? That was a unique environment. People sort of often knew the brand a little bit before they came. They liked the quirkiness of it. They liked that there was always something unique. And so some of the stranger wines, or I wouldn't say strange because the wines themselves weren't strange, but they were unusual. The more unusual wines would be very popular in the tasting room, where you could expose people to something and they got the opportunity to try it before they bought it. Direct sales was, my entire experience at Bonny Doon. So I've since probably developed more understanding of what goes into wine sales and other wine systems, right? But there, at least, I think it was, I would say more that people actually really enjoyed finding something that was a little bit different, but still close enough to what they were familiar with that they could, they felt okay trying it and going in open-minded to liking it.
So when the time came that you decided to head on to the next thing, why UC Davis, and what were you thinking about as sort of the next thing for you at that point?
Well, when I was at Bonny Doon, Randall was getting more and more deeply involved in biodynamic farming at his own vineyard, the Caudal Hollow Vineyard. And he would invite the staff to go and take part in certain practices, like we'd grind crystals to fill the cow horns, and I got to go down and do tours of the vineyard and see their compost making practices. And the viticulturist down there, Nadine, she actually ended up working up here in Oregon for a good time. She was really excited describing things like planting native plants for windbreaks that would draw pollinators, and all of these practices that kind of meshed with the agroecology background that I'd had in college. And so I knew that I wanted to do viticulture. That was what sort of drove me to find it. And I was really motivated by concepts of sustainable farming. I felt at the time that Davis would be the best school to get a really strong scientific foundation that I could bring into sustainable farming. So it would be science-driven sustainability, which meshes better with my background and my interests and experience, as opposed to other pathways that, also work. But that was my main motivation for going to Davis. They had such a strong reputation, and then Randall had also gone to Davis, and so I was able to get him to write my letter of recommendation, and that helped too.
What was the experience like there for you?
I loved it. It was kind of an odd experience in that I went in as a second back, actually, and spent a year doing that. And while I was doing that, I met Dave Smart, who ended up becoming my PI. And he did a presentation where he described that he had funding for a graduate student to do research in Spain. And so I immediately jumped on that opportunity and went and talked with him. And by the next year, I was in the graduate program. But I would spend all my summers during grad school in Spain doing research at a beautiful winery there, Ferrer Bobet, looking at water stress in complex slopes vineyards. And so my experience in that sense was a little bit different because I was never really constantly in Davis. I was very separated from it for long chunks of time, and then I would go back and be enmeshed in it during the school year. And while I was doing all of that, I met my husband abroad in Spain, and ended up having, my life turned upside down yet again. So I don't know. I guess it was a really pivotal time for me in a lot of respects. I learned a lot, and really I look at Davis as having set sort of a framework and a foundation for all that I've been able to learn since.
You were excited about viticulture at the time you went in, but you hadn't really studied it or really been involved in it yet at that point. Was it what you expected? Was viticulture what you expected it to be?
My research in Spain was very similar to my research experiences previously, as in extremely challenging. What can go wrong will go wrong. Field work is just like that. And so in that respect, it was exactly what I anticipated. I think that I'm always still being challenged by what viticulture is in reality, and it's ever evolving, depending on your employer, your clients, the vineyards that you're working with, your coworkers. All of those things impact what your role actually is, and that can evolve and change over time.
So at this point, you've been in Spain. You've met your now husband. You're coming up at the end of your program there. What were you thinking about as your next step, and what was your next step?
I had thought that coming out of grad school, my next step would be a year or two of internships until I'd have some actual experience under my belt to get a real job. And so I started applying for internships for the summer. And actually, I don't remember which internship it was that how many I applied for, but I was interviewing for one internship, and the owner turned to me and said, I think you need to take my other open position, which is a viticulturist. So I heard that and basically said yes, without necessarily doing all my research. I negotiated that I would be able to still have like a day off every week to work on my thesis. And he agreed to that. And so I thought that I had really negotiated a great deal, but the reality was that the workload was enough that having time to work on a thesis just was not feasible. Mm-hmm. So I took that role, and it ended up being a very good learning experience, and not always in a fun way. That was Hill Wine Company, which has been quite a bit in the news at one time or another. While I was working there, they went through, what can I say? There were financial challenges, And some of the choices that the owner made in order to meet those financial challenges may not always have been above board. He actually, I think, served some jail time at one point for some of the stuff. And there were big articles in the New York Times about problems that he ran into with the TTB and labeling laws and a lot of those things. So it was a great learning experience. And I felt very fortunate when things sort of imploded there, that I met great people through that process, and I ended up being, I'll say, rescued by Bacchus Vineyard Management. There were some connections, there were some people working at Hill trying to get through some of the challenges there, and who had friends at Bacchus. Glenn Alexander, the owner of Bacchus, spoke with his friend, and based on their conversation just said, okay, we'll hire her. I never even had an interview. I think I spoke to one person from the company and met another, and when it actually turned out I was hired retroactively by a week because they couldn't pay me. So it worked out very much in my favor. And I ended up having a great team at Bacchus that most of whom I still work with now because we all transitioned to Atlas together. I think Bacchus was one of the earlier acquisitions that Atlas made.
And where was Bacchus based?
Out of Sonoma County, Windsor, just north of Santa Rosa.
So that's an interesting transition now, going from working for a place to working for vineyard management. Tell me what that transition was like, and did you enjoy the work?
Yeah, vineyard management is a little bit, in my experience, it's been a little bit chaotic. But, I was coming from a certain amount of chaos as well, so maybe that says something about me. I don't know. But I do like a challenge. And, it's got a customer service element. So my background at Bonny Doon applied pretty neatly to that. But the customer service is with a smaller group of clientele that you develop a stronger relationship with. So I liked that aspect a lot. I still really enjoy working with clients and helping them achieve their goals and getting to know them as individuals. You meet some pretty incredible people that way. But I did find vineyard management at the time. I was both a viticulturist and a vineyard manager. I wore lots and lots of hats. I was maybe borderline accountant. I did all the budgeting. It was pretty intense. And the working hours were day and night, and also very intense. I think the agricultural work week back then was 60 hours before overtime in California, and a 10-hour work day. And that meant if you were a manager that you were working those 60 hours plus XYZ hours on top of that, preparing and planning and organizing and talking with people and coordinating, loads and loads of logistics. And at that point in my life, that was fine. But it became far more challenging when I had my son, which fortunately by that time I had transitioned to Atlas and was solely a viticulturist. With an expectation closer to, like a 40-hour work week, which was, I don't know if I could have done it otherwise. And a lot of people who work in vineyard management on that scale, we were a small company that was growing and getting bigger and bigger. And to function on that scale, you do have to put in just loads and loads of effort, time and effort. I think a lot of people who try to work in those environments end up with burnout. So I also consider myself fortunate that I made a transition at the right time for that.
So let's talk about the time with Bacchus a little bit. What was the work you were doing, and how did you kind of get to understand what you needed to do and how to do it?
So what I was, and it's still the case with vineyard management, what you do varies a lot through the year. It's completely seasonally driven. The winters are when you try to clean up projects and prepare and plan, and then as soon as the grapevines start to grow, it's akin to triage, I think, until the grapes are off the vine and things settle down again for the next winter. Winters are never long enough, and that's just sort of the way it goes. But what you are doing during the growing season, at Bacchus, it was mixed. Again, I wore so many different hats at any given day. It could be a number of different things. I might be out doing, training my scouts how to detect mildew, how to take leaf water potential measurements, trying to find and hire staff, all of that. Or I might be meeting a crew and showing them thinning protocols, or running chemicals out for a spray, writing work orders for sprays, doing pesticide safety training, all of those things. And that's part of the challenge of it, is that you have to constantly be juggling your priorities. I think that I learned pretty quickly that things like spray activities are high priority. There's a safety risk for people. There's a quality control risk for the fruit. But then getting paid is also a priority. So things like invoicing and checking the invoices and making sure they're accurate before they get sent out, all of those things, it was always a juggle to make sure that those things happened in a timely fashion and with the right level of quality control, but that things kept running in the vineyard too.
Tell me about the clients at that point. What were their sort of expectations of the work you would do, and how did you sort of come to understand what they wanted from you and how to do it?
You think about that. It's a challenging question. I think a lot of that depended on how they would interact with our team, because there were, I'll say, 3 or 4 people at the company that would have direct client interactions, and each client would have slightly different expectations of what the roles of those different individuals would be. We would shuffle responsibilities a certain amount among us. We worked really tightly as a team in order to ensure that, those clients' needs were being met, but that they were able to work with somebody that they preferred to work with as well. Certain relationships would at times become strained, and then you'd shift who was handling more of the communication there. But for the most part, I think my role was always more of the viticulturist in the arrangement, and the others were more the managers. So if it was logistics related issues or planning, they'd be handled primarily by the others in my group. And if it was more, fruit quality, crop estimation, water stress, all of those things, then it would land more on me. But I think I learned because my team and I learned together. So it's hard to say that I figured out what every client needed and what they wanted. It was more that as a group we would discover what was necessary and what worked best for each situation.
So tell me about the transition then from Bacchus into Atlas when it was acquired. How did the transition go, and how did your role evolve?
Well, let's see. When I came to Atlas, it was still a little uncertain whether the acquisition was going to happen or not. Actually, I made this shift just before the acquisition took place. And so they, I think, had a recommendation. Well, I know that my colleague had referred me to them, and they interviewed me. They didn't actually have a position for a viticulturist at the time, but they hired me based on that recommendation in the interview. They decided that one thing I love about Atlas is that they really love to promote talent. They like to bring in talented people and then work with them to find a role that they'll fill well, and take advantage of people's strengths. So I ended up becoming part of their viticulture team. They had me reporting to our director of viticulture, Francisco Araujo, whereas previously I think the viticulturists had reported directly to vineyard managers. And so that was a shift from what was expected, and ended up being working out quite well for me in the sense that I learned how to differentiate my priorities and viticultural needs versus what I'd done before as a vineyard manager and having my hands in everything, having to juggle always. I was able to focus my priorities a lot more in that respect. Francisco is another person that I've learned so much from. He ended up becoming a really great mentor for me. So that helped as well. And for the first time in my career, I was not just a viticulturist trying to figure it all out on my own, but I was part of a viticultural team. That was something that I really enjoyed. Usually at smaller companies and at wineries and that sort of thing, you as a viticulturist are expected to be an expert on everything all the time. And your only opportunities for learning are by working outside of your company and working within the industry to learn. So continuing education opportunities and making friends and, meeting with friends and discussing problems that way. But in this case, it was the first time where I could actually discuss in great depth specific situations. We could walk the vineyard together and look at things and bounce ideas off each other. It's a great environment for learning. And shortly after I arrived at Atlas, I found out that I was pregnant. So it made a big shift. I ended up my first year at Atlas missing harvest because I was on maternity leave. So I think that part was super scary at first because I'd just changed jobs, so I didn't have job protection, and I didn't know how the folks at Atlas were going to take it. But they were hugely supportive. So that, one of those moments when you're, again, very fortunate, you land in the right place with the right people. And so that had an impact on how my career shifted there as well, in that, I didn't work that harvest, and I haven't had direct involvement in harvest since. Mostly it's more from a quality control standpoint and maturity analysis, those sorts of elements. I'm able to focus more still on the viticulture during a time of year when most people are, it's all hands on deck to get the fruit off the vine. So in that respect too, it's been pretty fascinating because we're able to do things like virus surveys and dead vine counts and things that at that time of year are the best time of year to do it, but you're usually so caught up in harvest in most smaller companies that those things fall through the cracks.
So give me an idea now in the new role. You mentioned before kind of how kind of chaotic and triage your job was. In this role, tell me a bit more about what your year looks like and what the sort of the focuses are.
Yeah, so and the winter is still the same. I use a lot of that time for keeping up with continuing education, and also strategic planning out what things we're going to address that year and where I can make improvements in our processes from the previous season. Any hiring needs, that's the time of year when we focus on that. And then pretty much starting in around March, the focus becomes much more on pest management and the fungicide programs, fertilization, and getting things ready to go for the season. Let's see, I think that the growing season, we have a very specific time frame that's all driven by the phenology of the grapevine. So, bud break is a very important period of time because that's your start point for the season. And then, and at that point, I'm focused very much on weed management, certain pests that we deal with at that time. And then we shift into our crop yield estimate efforts. So that's a big piece of what we do all season at various stages. We will do cluster counts after we sucker. We do lag phase weights just before veraison. We do set assessments post-bloom. So everything is driven by the season and the grapevines.
So at what point did coming back to Oregon become part of the plan?
Let's see. I'd always had it in the back of my mind as a possibility. It was very easy to stay in California, in the sense that there are a lot more jobs down there for the role that I'm kind of grown into, and what I enjoy doing. And I liked where I was, so it was hard to see making a move, but I always kind of had a desire to get back closer to my family, and I love the Oregon wine industry, like Pinot Noir, a lot. So I actually really enjoy the vineyards, the environment, and the wine, and all of that, the culture. But it was last year when the senior viticulturist for the Oregon region left Atlas, and I had just learned that my dad was fighting cancer. And so all of those things sort of lined up together. It felt like it was meant to be. And I got to stay at my same company. I didn't have to go work. I think the other bigger employer in vineyard management up here is RP, and they're our biggest competitor. So I'd always worried that if I went up to Oregon, I'd end up working against my team instead of working with my team, which, it's not that bad in terms of the competition between the companies or anything, but I have a very strong loyalty to the people I work for and work with. And so this was just about a perfect opportunity to come up and do all of that. The only hardship in that decision was the timeline. Well, that's one of two, and the other one was that I didn't get to keep working with Carl, who left and I replaced, because I've really enjoyed working with him up until that point. He actually has been really wonderful in welcoming me up here into this industry and kind of introducing me to people and guiding me through some of the challenges of learning the differences in the way things are done up here versus the way they're done in California.
You mentioned the timeline.
The timeline. Yeah, so I think I found out that Carl was leaving in May, and I had to move my family to be here in June. So that was pretty intense. We also had to buy a house, so I had to find 2 places to live, one for while we got up here, and then had to buy a home as well. So we ended up moving up the 11th of June, and then moving into our new home on like the 1st of July. So it was a very challenging timeline.
So at that point, what were your impressions and what was your familiarity with the Oregon wine industry?
So let's see. I had, I think I mentioned I'd been up and done some wine tasting in the past, and I had also had some involvement with our farming operations up here before I made the transition. Atlas has grown up in Oregon, but they started quite small. And at those earlier stages, we did a lot of the viticulture from our California hub, what could be done, working with interns or vit techs up here who would report to viticulture down there, and we'd work on figuring everything out. So I made at least one trip a year up here over those years, sometimes twice. And so I did have, some knowledge of the team up here, some knowledge of a few of the vineyards. Atlas at the time were involved with some properties directly as at least part owners. So those properties were the ones that I was more familiar with. When I would come up here, they were where I'd put more of my attention. And so, we're still farming those properties now, which is great. I've got, I find that the way that I assimilate new properties personally is it takes a little bit of a process. I need a framework before information starts to actually have a place to go. And so it's a very organic process of assimilation to grow knowledge of a site. It really helped to have some framework already in place when I made that transition, a context for all the information. But it was also, a challenge because the rest of the properties were all new to me. And Atlas is still on a growth trajectory. So this past season, they acquired New Gen Vineyard Management, and we added again another round of new properties. So this has been a unique challenge for me in that, normally I've stayed with a company for a number of years, and every year you add a couple new ranches, a few new ranches, and in the context of a number of sites that you already are very familiar with and know quite well, adding in a few more each year is not that challenging. But taking on large numbers of new sites all at once is hard. I feel like that has been probably the biggest challenge with coming up here. There have been others. Our team was pretty light staffed when I arrived, so I've been building that since I arrived as well, trying to get our team up to the size that is needed to, and with the right people, to be able to grow the viticultural aspect of what we're doing here to meet sort of the standards that I had from our California office. There's also, you talked a lot about client expectations, and I've found that is a lot less clear-cut up here as well. I think that, the industry is, in some respects, a little bit newer, and so some of the roles are not as clearly defined. And also just the scale that we had been up here. We're growing more now, and so it makes sense to departmentalize things more. But at a smaller scale, there was a lot more overlap, more similar to what things were like where I was at Bacchus. So that's been a bit of a shift as well in trying to work towards the goal of a more departmentalized, systematic approach where we can provide, the same services to all of our clients and have expectations that we can, this kind of report is going to come out at this point in the season, and that kind of report is going to come out at this other point in the season. While still addressing, all of our clients' sort of different expectations of what our department will provide for them. There are a lot of vineyard managers up here who are sort of that in between a viticulturist and a vineyard manager. They have a lot of viticultural knowledge, and they're used to sort of having to do it on their own, right? And so I think that some people have an expectation when they meet me and, oh, here's your new viticulturist. They're like, okay, so you're going to be out here telling the crew what to do. You're going to be scheduling the spray and when the tractor's going to arrive and all of that. And I try to avoid being the person responsible for those things. We have the managers to do that. And it's a different skill set to be really good at logistics than it is to be able to go in, walk a vineyard and figure out, what we can do to make it better and diagnose problems and propose solutions, those sorts of things. So trying to, I guess, find ways to, what's the phrase they use, stay in my lane and focus on what I'm good at.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. That was going to be my next question. Tell me about getting to know a site and diagnosing a site. So if you're introduced to a new place, what are you looking for and how long does it take you to feel comfortable sort of understanding where it's at and knowing what it needs?
I think I'm still learning that to a certain extent. I mean, I think I mentioned because of the challenge of having so many different sites, I feel like that transition is taking longer than I'm used to it taking. But where I have, and then there's also the client expectations aspect. So some clients are, they want me to be very involved right off the get-go. And in those cases, I'm there more, and it does help me to assimilate those sites faster, right? In other cases, I think that I use a lot more technology and other aspects to determine where I need to spend my time and my focus to learn sites. I have a staff that I work with very tightly so that they are more often my eyes in the field. I've developed certain scouting protocols and systems for like what I need them looking for at what times of year, what information I need back as a bare minimum. Like say everything looks fine, I still need to know, what % bloom are we at? What, how tall is the canopy? Are the wires in place? All of those sorts of things. So yeah, it's all looking great, but how is it looking right now? So those things really help. And then I also, we do a lot of NDVI imagery, and I use that for a number of different purposes through the season. It also directs me to potential problem spots and areas where I need to focus more attention. And then the whole diagnostics aspect, you can't get that. I mean, the technology very much helps, but there's a certain element to seeing things with your own eyes that is hugely necessary because everything that you see needs to be in a context. You look at photos, you're seeing one cluster or two clusters. That doesn't tell you very much unless it's in the context. Some diseases present with leaf symptoms, and so you might get fruit symptoms. Without the leaf symptom, they are one thing. If they do also have the leaf symptom, then there's something else. And that is all something that takes time and experience to develop the diagnostic skill. So I use my staff primarily as a starting point for determining where I need to focus more of my own energy. And then clients also. We have a lot of clients here who have who are very involved in farming their properties, and they know their ranches very well. Those are actually some of the best to work with, because they can say, there's an issue going on over here in this block, and I don't know what it is. And that is always very helpful, because then I can put time and energy into figuring that out for them. And then we look at yields and listen to feedback from wineries and winemakers. That can be also hugely informative of finding a problem and fixing it. If there's a problem with ripening, or if they have high potassium levels in the must and acidity issues, all of those can focus our attention on what's going on at that vineyard, and do we need to address it with a different fertilization program, or water, in some of our irrigated sites, could we achieve better results with a different irrigation strategy? All of those things.
I know your Oregon viticulture experience is still fairly new and recent, but I'm curious, so far, is there a big difference farming grapes in Oregon versus farming grapes in California?
Yes and no. Grapes are grapes. They do all the same things in most places, but there's a lot of practices that are a little bit different. There's a culture to the industry, I'll say. There's a lot more dry farmed properties up here, a large number of organic and biodynamic. I mean, I don't get me wrong, I farmed a lot of organic sites in California too. I'm just talking about percentages, proportionally speaking. The live certification program, a lot of our clients are involved in the live certification program, so it's I've had to adapt some of my practices to be able to line up better with their specific requirements for those programs. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's still farming grapes, and they are, have a lot of more predictable things that are different, not because grapes are different here, but because the environmental conditions are slightly different. But if you put grapes in California under the same environmental conditions, you'd have the same things that you'd have to work with. So, and having farmed in Sonoma County really helps also, because it's a little bit more similar climatically speaking. Again, different, but but more similar, and more of the same varieties, a lot more Pinot Noir and Chardonnay there. I will say one thing I have noticed that is different about the Oregon wine industry is that there's much stronger sense of collaboration among growers and winemakers as well. But more of my experiences with growers. I've joined a number of different growers groups. I go to Patty Skinkis's VitTech meetings, and people are willing to share information. They're not afraid of, they're not as focused on privacy and proprietary stuff. So there is, and people will share things like, somebody's tractor breaks down, and another one of our clients will be fine with loaning a tractor to their neighbor. So that is kind of nice to see. I've really enjoyed that aspect of the way things are done up here. One thing there are a number of things that are just oddly different, and it's more just the way they've been done historically, but things like harvest, being into buckets instead of into bins. It's one of the things that makes me glad I'm not a vineyard manager anymore, because I can't imagine having to tick off every bucket. I really liked how picks in California were team oriented, so the team, yes, still incentivized pay based on yields, but the team gets, each player on that team gets an equal part of the pie, so to speak. And I don't know, I always felt like you saw people working together really nicely under those conditions. And it's less work on the vineyard manager.
I know one of the things that's unique to Oregon versus California is obviously yield size and expectations. So does that change your approach in any way, looking at yields that are so much smaller?
Yeah, that's actually something I've been thinking about a lot right now, because I've been putting out all my yield estimates. And I have never in the past been in a situation where people are so anxious to get their yield estimates as quickly as possible, because they're waiting to make all of their thinning decisions until they've got the yield estimates in front of them. In California, the purpose of yield estimates is to know how many bins to have there, and the winery to know what size tank they need, and manage expectations. Whereas here, they're making critical decisions to hit target yields and stuff based on those estimates, which makes the estimates a little bit more frightening too, in that there's less room for error. And estimates are always an estimate. So you kind of need to put more time and effort into them, but you have less time to do it. I think that I have never been asked before for a thinning protocol to get down to less than 1 cluster per shoot. It's mind-boggling to me that any winemaker would want you to drop down to less than 1 cluster per shoot, barring, maybe short shoot, weak plants, that sort of thing. And so a lot of our thinning protocols in California are driven more by things like fine health and some sort of standard practice. They do a lot more thinning before veraison, like fruit thinning before veraison, just based on standard practices. And then what yields you get are the yields you get after that. Or what, the winemaker has found that works for that block. There's a lot of that as well. And so, they do a 1-2, 1-2 because that's what they always do. And so those decisions are made far earlier in the season, not on the fly after lag phase. So yeah, that's been a really big eye-opener for me. And I'm not sure, Patty Skinkis is doing her crop load study. I am hopeful that might influence people over time to be open-minded to the idea of addressing crop load from a different standpoint. But as of right now, there's a lot of perception that certain target yields are what you can do to achieve quality fruit. And a lot of fruit is put on the ground in pursuit of that.
You mentioned obviously the kind of the off season is continuing education and things like that. Tell me about how often are new challenges being presented to you, and how often are you having to learn or relearn a technique for pest management or for something like that?
I feel like it's pretty much constant. It's one of the things I really enjoy about what I do, is that you never stop learning. It never gets boring. But yeah, the industry is always shifting. Right now, everyone's focusing on climate change. And I think the word of the year has been resiliency, trying to make sure that we are doing everything possible to be able to respond quickly to seasonal shifts, big weather events, all of these things. These are unique challenges that yeah, we used to have heat waves, but now we're going to have a frost and then a heat wave and then hail. So, trying to figure out those elements, it's pretty intense. And then, from a pest control perspective, that's an area that I've put a lot of time and energy into in my career. And resistance management and integrated pest management, which are all integrated, right? And that there's always more to learn. There's always more research being done. There's always new products on the market. So again, there's always more to know and more to learn. But the context, the framework, doesn't change as much, right? Our biggest disease pressure every year, the thing we focus on the most is mildew prevention, powdery mildew prevention. And if it weren't for powdery mildew, I think our pest management would have a completely different approach and focus, right? Almost everything on the market for powdery mildew management is preventative. So you have a set system of sprays that, yeah, you might go a little bit longer in between intervals in a low pressure year and a little bit shorter between intervals in a high pressure year. But if you don't protect your vines against powdery mildew, you'll eventually get powdery mildew. So that framework stays the same from one year to the next, and then we just have to work within the context of, again, new products, resistance issues, and then the sustainable element, which is that we learn more about the chemistries that we use over time. And when new information comes to light, you have to adapt to that. New information about human toxicities, for example. It would be great if all of these products, we knew all of that about every single product, every single time the day it was first released and available. And they do a lot of testing. The FDA, or the EPA, sorry. There's a lot of work that goes into making sure that those products, when they are released, they know their risk factors. But that doesn't mean that they don't still learn new things down the road, and impacts on non-target pests, for example, or non-pest beneficial insects, those sorts of things. That there's always new information coming out, and so you have to adapt what you're doing to those. Continuing education is a huge part of what I do. Mm-hmm.
So you talked a little bit about your kind of initial impressions of Oregon. What does the industry look like to you, and where is it going?
Well, I think I've mentioned I've noticed a lot of collaboration in the industry up here. People are doing it because they're passionate about what they're doing. They love what they do. They love wine. I really enjoy that aspect of the Oregon wine industry. We have a lot more small growers up here who are very involved with their farms. Not saying that we don't, again, we have those in California too, but proportionally speaking, I see a lot more small properties that are owned by people who are involved in the farming themselves and maybe even live on site. And that I hope won't change fast. I really enjoy that element of it. In terms of where the industry is going, I don't know that I've been here long enough to formulate an opinion on that. The wine is fantastic already. There's been a huge focus on quality in wine over the last decades in Oregon, right? And I think that more and more of the world has recognized that there are top quality wines produced in this growing region. It'll be interesting to see how things go from a wine marketing standpoint and how they continue to build the Oregon brand, so to speak, Willamette Valley brand. In that, there are a lot of different ways it could go, right? And it is challenging to to come up with a strategy that will promote the region and not just a specific winery or a specific wine style. One thing I think we're going to see is just, unfortunately, induced by climate change, there may be some shifts in stylistically how wines are made here and what their flavor profiles end up being. And that might drive some shifts in the way it needs to be marketed as well, right? So I think that the biggest challenge is going to be adaptability. The industry up here is still growing, it's still learning, and for all of us, we're going to have to be adaptable to what happens.
So you took kind of an interesting path into viticulture side, coming from the sales and marketing side. So I'm curious, now that you're on the vineyard side, do you find yourself with a different connection to wine, or a different connection to the wines you drink?
I think I am more of a vineyard appreciator than a wine appreciator at this point in my life. I still love wine, and I drink wine, but I'm more motivated by the process of growing than this, my early interest in the discovery of training my palate and learning how to appreciate wine and the food and wine and travel element of all of it. I think I'm much more intellectually stimulated by things like developing the best pest management strategy and adapting to resistance issues and sustainable practices, selecting the right cover crop programs, do we till or not till, carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions, all those things that my husband finds incredibly boring are the things that I could study them for the rest of my life and never get bored. So.
Well, on that note, what is coming next for you? What are you looking ahead to, either personally or professionally, that has you excited?
Well, I feel like I'm still in the middle of my transition up here. So in terms of what's next, I'm looking forward to getting to a point where I am thinking more about what's next and less focused on the here and now and assimilating. I am looking forward to being more involved with our sustainable practices and the decisions that are made in that respect. In California, I was the person who initially got all of our vineyards certified sustainable under the CSWA certification. We had a lot of support for that process. I couldn't have done it on my own, but I was the person that kind of pushed it as a company that we go to the extra effort of certifying all of our ranches, and then adapting greater and greater sustainability into what we do all the time. I think I'm hopeful that my role, I can get back to focusing more on that element as I solidify the processes and systems and things for what I'm doing here.
Last question for you. If someone were to ask you for words of advice or wisdom about entering the wine industry, what would you tell them?
I think that I'd probably start by asking them some questions about what their interests in the wine industry are. For example, when I'm interviewing people for the viticulture department, I usually quiz them a lot to figure out if they are actually interested in science and plants, and not just interested in winemaking and wine. That is the main draw into the industry, right? Although there are others, I have I've had an intern this year who's, from a 5th generation farming family. He's been very involved in farming, and they're moving into grapes as a crop. So he wanted to learn more about grapes to support his family's business. But overall, a lot of people are drawn into this, like I was, through the wine. And so helping them to figure out what they're really most interested in is I think one of the better elements of it. But I got some good advice when I was looking at all of this, and I think it still holds, which is that the more you get an opportunity to explore different areas within the industry before you settle on something, the better you'll be able to find a job that you love. Because the one thing about this industry is that all of the roles that I've come across in it, winemaker, viticulturist, vineyard manager, they're all a lot of work. They're not a way to get rich quick. And if you don't enjoy what you're doing, it won't be worth it.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that we didn't cover today that you'd like to cover?
Oh, gosh. Let's see. I don't think so. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, and I think I'm reaching the capacity of what my brain is able to speak coherently about. So.
Good. We don't want to cross that line. That's
No.
good. That's good. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your story with us, sharing this beautiful spot with us. This has been truly a nice way to spend a day. So we'll go ahead and let you off the hook. Thank you very much.